The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF and Pride Seeds. Steve, a lot of focus in 2012 on corn yields. The struggles in the U.S. are becoming more and more well documented. Some very low yields in some areas. We're not as much concerned about 300 and 400 bushel corn. We're now trying to get to 150 in some areas. Where are we at with corn yield and how the genetics have really kept yields higher in the case of a terrible drought?
Well, I think the gain we've made on genetics in terms of stress tolerance is really pronounced. You see that in some areas in some hybrids versus others. And if you're a breeder, for instance, in a lot of areas this year, it's going to be, even though it's terrible from a yield perspective, the nice thing about when you're selecting, it's better than a year where everything looks fantastic, because you're really going to be able to pull out of the pile of different things that you're testing what seems to handle the stress better, and to do some further breeding on that. I mean, this is the type of year where you're right, Sean, the focus sort of goes to surviving as opposed to how are we going to maximize the yield. Some of those things, though, and I think what's going to be interesting as we go through the winter, is some of those things that we were doing to maximize the yield were probably some of the things that helped us to keep some of that yield in a stress year. And those are things not only in terms of genetics choice and trait choices, may have been the fertility strategies that we went with, may have been by making sure we put an in-season fungicide on the corn, for example. That probably gave us something that allowed us to manage the stress and to keep that plant healthier for longer, so that we could maximize the yield with the moisture that we've got. The story from this year also is, when you look at from a North American perspective, is it's not so much the lack of rain that probably hurt. When you go to the US, it was really the heat. And you had situations, whether it was in commercial production or seed production, where the irrigation, you were able to keep some moisture on that crop all the time. But it was really the 100+ degree days. It was the 90, 100 degree nights where the corn plant never had a break. It never had an opportunity to take a breath of fresh air and then be able to survive and worry about reproduction. So that's where we saw issues this year, was really temperature driven.
So what do you think about Ontario? Obviously, we had some dry weather, we had some warm weather, but nothing to the extent of the U.S. But we're still hearing farmers talk about we can expect some lower than expected yields. Yeah,
if we were in that 150+ bushel range last year in Ontario as an average, for example, this year we're probably going to be in the 130 somewhere. And maybe that might be in the high side. The story in Ontario this year, I mean, we had the heat for sure. What we were missing this year, and the same goes for the Midwest, was where were the general rains. So really it becomes a question of which concession did I live on, and in some cases it probably didn't matter whether you paid your taxes or not, but it came down to where were the spotty showers. So we've got areas near me, for example, down near Chatham, where there's some pockets, if they thought there was a cloud in the sky, they got an inch of rain. And you got other people, like where my farm is, for example, where we missed a lot of the showers. It would sort of divide and go around our area. And it was just a function of how the system's set up this year. So where the crop is going to be good, it's going to be very good. Where the crop is going to be poor, it's going to be very poor. We've got counties where there was corn that was chopped in July and August, just because with the heat and the lack of rain, there was nothing there.
You said last year the average was 150, this year we're thinking about 130. That's only 20 bushels, but in a market that's $8 a bushel, and we've got some pretty high land rents in some cases, that makes a big difference. It
makes a big difference, and that's and in that case we're talking about an average, but really on farms we're going to see the extremes. I've talked to producers that are going to have 40 bushels per acre. I know producers that if they could be 220, 230, 240 bushels per acre.
What does a 40 bushel corn crop look like?
It doesn't look good. So you've got small ears. You've probably got plants that started to shut down in the summer, and they focused all their resources. It's probably going to have poor stalks because it's cannibalized those stalks to put something into any sort of an ear that it was able to produce. You're going to have ears with tip back, so the top of the ear is going to be missing. I mean, you're going to see soup to nuts in some of these fields. And at the end of the day, it's not a very good situation to be in, but it's literally just a function of where you live this year and whether you had the rain or not.
So what did this year teach us in Ontario? Did it teach us, did we learn anything from this that we can apply to future years?
I think it's going to be interesting this winter when we dissect through all the data and the research that was done to see what kind of practices allowed us to survive the stress a little bit better. We did some research. This was the second year where we were focusing on a 300 bushel initiative, and really the goal there was what can we do to maximize yield in terms of nitrogen strategies, in terms of fungicide applications, population management. And I think we're going to really look at the numbers as we go through the winter to see what we learned under really a variety of situations where all these plots were at. So there'll be some interesting, last year what we learned was that the nitrogen rates, even in the dry areas, we saw a yield bump. And it was an economic payback. Didn't seem to matter how much more nitrogen you added, there seemed to be an economic payback there. So we want to analyze that. Fungicide applications pretty much automatically gave us a payback in terms of yield over what the application costs and the treatment costs were. So these are all things we're going to look at this year. Population is going to be interesting. I think the drive has been towards higher populations. This was the type of year probably in a dry situation it didn't pay, right? But on the whole, what did we see? And that's what we're going to look at this winter in terms of what kind of recommendations we can go out with.
And this is a below average year, and so it's you have to be very, very cautious to make plans for next year based on this year's conditions.
Yeah, you're right, Sean. I mean, if there's one thing in agriculture in general, our memories tend to be what we last experienced and making plans on what we last experienced, as opposed to looking at the composite of evidence over the last few years in terms of what were the average conditions and what led us to maximize yields in those situations. So we've got to be really careful not to draw too many conclusions from a very dry year when next year could be, like last year was very wet, by example. This year was very dry in a lot of areas. It was the opposite in different parts of the country. And so we've got to be careful to draw too many conclusions from one season.